significant in terms of our deficit. It's essentially because there are these inequalities in these subsidies. And I underline perception because it's not justifiable. Again, as I think was repeated in several times yesterday, that the higher cost of capital, the greater debt servicing requirements, are the result of perception that are completely invalid if we're looking at actual returns on capital globally over the past 2 or 3 decades, and particularly the past 2 decades. An investor who has invested in one of the defaulting countries' currency, rather than in US Treasury, would get 5 times the return. And this is what the countries that defaulted. So financial investors are taking that as higher risk in countries that are defaulted. And of course, that means that all of the countries at the bottom of the hierarchy face much greater costs in terms of the interest rate, but it's also they don't dare to do anything in emergency. They then increase their public borrowing, they try and control their public debt. We know that there's no global financial system, which the IMF was mandated to provide. The lack of global debt resolution has been talked about enough already. I don't think we would believe at that point. And of course, we know that as a result, the financial architecture doesn't really address the central challenges of financial development or the way possible. In addition, and that's the second part of the issues that I was looking for, we find that very volatile commodity prices of food and energy in particular have huge impact on both producers and consumers in our country. And so the crazy thing is that in periods of rising commodity prices, it's not such a direction, because in and often even the producing countries don't see consumers obviously lose. And of course, the opposite happens. Consumers don't gain when the prices fall, and the producers don't necessarily benefit. I mean, the producers also in effect lose. What's happening is that much more of these profits are garnered by intermediaries, large multinational corporations in both food and trade. Now, talking about the full cost of capital, which was such a big, or at least was an attempt to become a big issue in the South African G20 presidency, it did not succeed because of the resistance to the country. But if you look at the public debt to GDP ratio in Africa, it's really not that very much compared to other regions. So I don't want to even see charts here, but if you look at general government growth debt by region, and it's in the middle. Can you see the middle set of charts? It's low, in other words. Those public debt to GDP is really low in Africa compared to certainly much lower than the high income countries. And if you look at the proportion of national income rather than GDP, again, it is not large relative to other regions. And in fact, it has not been large now for a significant period. But African countries pay much higher borrowing costs. Now, this one is going to be easy because Africa, the orange one, like you can see on top, dramatically higher than on the bottom. Relative to the USA, which is of course the largest borrower in the world, but even relative to Latin America, only recently that Latin American bonds and African bonds have experienced a period of being kind of equivalent, but once again, African bonds are very good. So that today they face on average 9.8 percentage points higher. I mean, that's unbelievable. Most businesses in the developed world, in which countries would be unviable if they took that kind of borrowing cost. And if you look at the average spread, you can see how dramatically it has shot up for Africa. That's the right hand. But if you look at the period before the pandemic and the period after the pandemic,
check the online stream.
In average spread between the US Treasury and in much higher than in either Asia or Latin America. And of course, this matters because we know that there's obviously that whole decline in the but also there's a much greater role of private creditors who are now accounting for more than half of architects on average. And within that business, you bring it to that financial exposure. I'm sorry, I now realize that you made this start bigger. I don't know how much you can actually see it. But if you look at net ODA, so that's the darker red line, it's been falling very significantly from 1990, that's basically from 1970 onwards, been falling. We will start in the COVID period, but then remain much, much lower than before. The remittances have played a very major role in shoring up development payments in Africa. Foreign direct investment, again, very volatile, has increased, there is a decline, growth cycle in the just but the external there, which is very oriented, shows similar volatility only. In other words, we tend to rise with ODA and fall with ODA as well. External debt stock. And if we look at the composition of that, we see Africa now 42% is private creditors. Africa used to be dominated by multinational creditors. It is now dominated by private creditors. How does this play out in terms of how the countries have to behave? Now, this is not Africa specific. This is really looking at three categories of countries: high income, middle income, and low income. But this is what happened. It played out in the period of the pandemic and the initial post-pandemic Ukraine war here. So these are the two big shocks that the developing world has had to face. And what you see is that it's really the rich countries that dramatically increase their government expenditure. These are averages. So as you can see, the blue is high-income countries on the left, and a significant increase of about 10 to 12 percentage points of GDP in government expenditure. In the United States, it increased by 28%. But that's again 28% of GDP increase between January 2020 and March 2021 in just additional spending. Put that in further perspective, on average, the US government spent an additional $26,000 per person over that period. Additional. Low-income countries, on average, spend $2 per person additionally. That's the kind of difference in impact that we're talking about, just in macroeconomic terms. Middle-income countries, yes, increased a little bit, but already not that much, and then they lowered it very quickly. Low-income countries, the bottom line there, mostly in Africa, barely increased their spending at all. Through these crises, through the COVID-19 pandemic, through the period of the Ukraine war, when dramatically there were increases in food and food prices. And so we find, yes, the primary deficit for high-income countries shot up. They also shot up for middle-income countries. They went up much less for low-income countries. Of course, it will go up because you're losing revenues in these crises. But spending had not increased. So the deficit increased much less in low-income countries. So who was fiscally disciplined there? The most fiscally disciplined, the most badly behaved in most systems were the high-income countries. So who should that capital markets punish? What should bond markets be telling us? They should be telling us that the high-income countries are really going to get it. They're going to be smashed by the bond market because they're being so fiscally limited. Well, what actually happens? No, we don't. All right, don't tell me like that. Yeah, here we are. It worked out precisely the other way. So once again, because of the higher spending of the rich country, the blue line, general government debt GDP ratio, okay, go up to 123% in the peak, and then fall slightly to 112% of GDP. For middle-income countries, yes, it goes up from about 55 to about, no, 55 to 66 to about 68. But well below what should be considered a very problematic number. But low-income countries, again, dominantly in Africa, stay below 45% throughout the entire period. Stay really low because of all that tremendous effort that themselves imposed. Even after they're staying from that service, they are maintaining these low levels. So bond markets should be favoring the low-income countries, right, for being so good, for being so well behaved. Here's the spread on government debt for the low and middle income countries taken together, that's an orange line, and as you can see, one peak in the middle of the pandemic, and the next peak comes after the Ukraine war, dramatic increases in the spreads. On average, these are the average rates. Most African countries face spreads of 9 to 11% points. Really incredibly high spread on the government debt. The blue line is the spread for other advanced economies. It looks flat because it is. It stayed at below 1 basis point. In other words, it stayed at below 0.01%. It stayed incredibly low to our constitution, despite their fiscal responsibility, etc., etc. We think all of these terms are nonsensical. Capital markets do not respond to this. They respond to their own perceptions, which are what drive the currency hierarchy that I mentioned. A lot of this happens later on credit rating agencies, and it's true, credit rating agencies are valued for much of the developing world. And there's an interesting estimate done by the UNDP that if you actually look at economic fundamentals and what turned out to have happened, etc., and if you have done the credit rating accordingly, then you would have got very, very different proposals for the behavior of the bond market and as a result of the spread that it is. And if you look at those differences, you would find that African nations would have been able to access an additional $31 billion easily at lower rates. Okay? So they look at the development cost of these credit rating agencies. The cost of the credit rating discrepancies that have highlighted on the in the right-hand chart, and you compare that to the ODA chart, it's significantly more. Okay. In fact, you could have, with a fraction of that amount, developed complete herd immunity to COVID-19. You could have reduced malaria by 90%. There were a lot of good reasons for that money that was wasted because of the way credit rating agencies actually dealt with Africa. And of course, once you have that problem, you have much higher debt servicing costs. And you end up with the negative transfer bonds. So on the left hand, you have the number of countries that are spending more than 5% of export on debt servicing. And you can see that in Africa, for the last 5 or 6 years, it's been in the range of 25 to 29 countries have been spending more than 5% export on public debt service. The number of countries with negative transfers on external public debt, that is, you are paying out more than you get. In Africa, is also in the range of 16 to 20 over the last 5 years. And clearly, that means that your interest costs as a proportion of revenue are rising. Africa is the orange line, the third in the left-hand column, as you can see, very, very sharp increases in interest payments as a share of your net revenues, or not net, sorry, total revenues. And of course, if you're looking at it in relation to public spending on health and education, then you have to start you're spending 44 billion on per person, sorry, not billion, but 44 per person, whereas you're spending you're spending $70 per person. But you're only able to spend 44 per person on health and 53 per person on education. So you're spending more on the district payments, which are unjustified. I want to keep repeating that. They are unjustified. But you're spending that because the African markets are falling. So what can you do? What can Africa do at the regional level? I think already the Africa Credit Rating Agency, I think, is an excellent idea and definitely needs to be supported and taken forward. It was established, as you all know, this year, and to provide independent, credible, and Africa-owned credit rating for sovereigns as well as corporate and provincial companies. Now, the purpose obviously is to enhance transparency. Currently, credit rating agencies are ultimately non-transparent. They give out a broad methodology, but it doesn't actually tell you the things that matter, the weight and how the panel is being done, which are mid-micro draws, and where you get segregating rises and declines without proper justification and legal being provided. So there is no completely transparent model that the crediting agency tools. Why we are doing it would be for African countries, one Africa, if the crediting agency is up and going, to insist that all of the public institutions will base their rating, will base their investment on this African crediting, and perhaps ensure that it is legally required for African nations to rely on this rather than on the big three. It's a very important way, but of course, it also must be operating on very transparent principles, which would then provide greater confidence to the rest of the corporate front. And of course, it's very possible to easy for Latin America, but certainly the attempt has been. The way to deal with the debt crisis is not more than. It seems to be standard solution. The whole attempt of the IMF and the intervention countries is to get that take it back into the next thing, rather than ensure a possibility of development without relying on more external. And it is possible. So if we actually encourage debt oriented only when there is a distinct requirement for foreign exchange for that particular project or activity. If we rely more on regional arrangements and different kinds of trade credit for other ways of keeping going, and if we do not necessarily get our sovereigns to go in for external debt, then we can actually shift away from debt to development. And of course, I certainly believe this should be accompanied by capital account controls for individual countries. The IMF, we talked about this about a decade ago, and then decided to forget about it, but they're beginning to say it again. Because you can't say capital controls in this neoliberal world, so we talk about capital management techniques, but they are certainly something that we need to consider. The other big area of potential, I believe, for Africa is and we know that it is a huge problem because we are once again back in the world where financial speculation and monopolistic behaviors in the global commodity markets can lead to dramatic politics as well. And we saw this happen in the period of the first year of the Ukraine war. Because broadly, the beginning in 2020, but then 2020, it was more than 2022. And the massive increase reached a very, very sharp increase. It comes in the period broadly from January to June of 2022, which is when, just after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, everybody thought, oh my God, these Ukraine and Russia both exporters, Russia the big exporter of fertilizer, this is going to affect the global wheat market and wheat supply. So commodity prices shot up. In fact, it did not affect global wheat supplies. As the companies that were announcing it new, because wheat is one of those universally produced commodities. If one area suffers, some other area will be doing something. There was no impact on supplies. I wish to repeat that. No impact on supplies. So nonetheless, those prices went up dramatically. The major agribusinesses made profits like never before. Some of them doubled their revenues. And of course, we have the major financial speculation. In wheat particularly, about 70% of that in the Paris wheat futures market was led by pension funds, by the way. So workers' income pension savings were being used to speculate in the global wheat market. But then they came down again. And they would obviously come down because the fundamentals were not for a rising price. But the entirely speculation and profit driven. It came down again. And you would say, and in fact, many people in the United States or like each currency, you say, well, no, it doesn't matter. But somebody came down again, yes, that's a big issue, but it's not a big issue. It is a big issue for the rest of us. Why? Because that period when it comes down, as you can see, from June 2022 to end 2023, that period when it comes down is not accompanied by falling prices in the rest of the industry. So if you look at the right-hand chart, the global price, the FAO food price index falls by 11.5% in that period. But prices keep increasing, food inflation rate, which is prices keep increasing in the rest of the world. A little bit in the high-income countries, almost 2.8%. In the low, in the higher income countries, by 10.3%. In the lower income countries, by 13.4%. But in low income countries, by 30%. 29.9% increase in food prices at a time when the global price is falling. So we go up when the global price goes up, but we don't come down when the global price comes down. A large part of that is due to the currency depreciation. And the problem is with the currency depreciation partly stems from that initial price increase, which puts pressure on our currency depreciation. And then it is exacerbated by the capital flows from all tendencies that I identified earlier. So what could a region like Africa do? And here, I'd like to emphasize the potential of regional food bucket stock, not just national, but regional. This is based on work that I have done with my colleagues, and others at the University of Massachusetts. But what we're really saying is the system provides an important price stabilization effort. To promote food sovereignty, responsible for dependence, strengthen the bargaining position of producers, because not just domestic private traders, but multinationals now, they have a monopolistic position in grain markets. And of course, because we know that the grain markets are so highly concentrated, 85% of global trade is controlled by just four companies, ABCD as they are known. And of course, throughout China, where we really got to 95%. But we can also therefore curb market concentration because the public agency is about it. And provide greater demand, use the grain you're collecting, provide food security for starving people. And also you can actually promote crop diversification in sustainable and climate resilient policy. So what we propose is what we call African grain management system, whereby it would purchase grain from within the African continent, but focusing first on crops that are dominantly consumed in Africa, but not just into the market, like sorghum, cassava, and different kinds of millets and so on. Because these are not, there's no real needed global trade in these. These are largely African crops consumed and produced in territories within Africa. But in addition, the ATM could produce from the world market those that are produced, but are still largely imported, rice, wheat, and maize. And all of these are really very good products to show the greatest vulnerability in the consumer. It's not meant to be an emergency reserve. ECOWAS has an emergency reserve. It hasn't been very successful, and we are such a reason for this. It is aid-driven, not locally controlled or nationally controlled. And it is, the emergency reserve, the problem with that is you start having when there's emergency. And so it's already too late to really get active. What we propose is a strategy of continuous procurement economy. So the stop putting a rate is based on reasonable estimates of demand from the management. And of course, we could address human rights violations, global fair policy, and access, and it would mitigate and manage changes. It's also meant to incentivize people to touch within Africa. So, as I said, you can do sorghum, cassava, and millets. You can store easily for a relevant period to prioritize local procurement with a minimum support price with a sufficient markup to encourage farmers to grow this crop. So you get a stable price that is regionally determined, and it's a market creating a role for these crops. So the AGM can have price fetching power. And of course, it won't actually estimate the procurement price according to the regional average cost of production, which comes kind of after. And if you are going to encourage this cultivation, which is important because these are much more climate-resilient crops, it requires the open-ended purchase of crop as the specified minimum support. And could then also promote climate resilient techniques, This would then be sold to member countries as defining and stabilizing. The point is that you are doing away with the volatility, you are defining the price in advance over the relative stability, and every member country that wants to invest in also. And so within countries, the government can do what they want with it. You can use it to provide grain directly to our households or for schooling programs or any other things that they want. To give you an example of the other kinds, and let me just describe the other kinds, which is when you're importing rates of rice stabilization, like rice from wheat. Then you buy from the global market when the prices are relatively low and across of different countries. The point is that if the HEMM is a bulk quantity, you're cannibalizing the imports from across all African countries. Then you have much bigger amounts of and you would be able to achieve much cheaper and more stable rates. So you would choose an indeterminately stabilized purchase price, plus any other external value you want to use, along with quality design. And member countries can then access that needs at that price. There are different options. One is you standardize all the imports of the external value. The other is where you say, well, okay, you are based on assessment of likely import demand of the less important countries. On the world prices are low, and then you distribute to the net importers only when the global prices are down. So this is much more limited, but either of these is actually possible. To show you how it could work for a cost ways, I don't know if you really see this. So the graph line is the global international price line, as you can see, the black line that is going up in the later period and then coming down again. The dotted lines are both deficit and surplus countries. Okay? And the gray lines are the surplus countries, the colored lines are deficit countries. What is fascinating is how they move in opposite directions. And that's really why it would be such a useful mechanism for the African region. Because you would be stabilizing across the region. The producer countries and the consumer countries would both be. Because at the moment when it is opposite in the main strategies, where you really need long. And as a result, both the producers and the consumers indicate that are subsidized. Okay. So the advantage is obviously, as I said, it provides predictability and availability. It encourages ecological sustainable crops. It provides a guarantee against unduly high prices. And it not short term which have been really adverse for many countries. The price will be short, the potential create for the poor, and it's more perfect with the inflation. And because it avoids this sudden, stop and start shop, standing of a course or other kinds of things, or sudden facing solutions. You want to say the consumers in your country would not face these solutions. So administration would also be a function without the threat of arbitrary action in the world. And the farmers in the third country, in Wales, for example, would not be so that they can affect something which will be described in the design. But ultimately, I think the goal would be to work towards sovereignty. That is a regional self-sufficiency on essential food items for Africa, which I think is going to become an increasingly important topic. Okay, thank you.
Who is coming next?
No, thank you very much.
Sasha.
Let's take the notes and so let's have let's get the response to that before we get to control conversation. Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor.
They don't give me that.
I think we'll describe the picture. Africa and there will be countries that listen. International financial is, Africa has a low representation in international financial institutions. For good reason, when they were being created, most African countries were purpose. So they went to have the same on those institutions. I knew how to manage them and said that. That's why they have no bigger influence with the system that are made, even as we speak. For instance, Africa has only 4.5% of the IMF capital, 4.5%, the whole of the so-called sub-Saharan Africa. That's why we make the allocation is that the lowest as a result of this contribution to the so, Professor Bush pointed out that the Africa is facing very challenging, like higher cost of debt, even though from now our debt lower compared with other industries. But the cost of debt is much higher for one. This one is the penalty plus yesterday. Then I have the first for debt. See that that is what for last year. 30,000 more for this done for and more than project. And what was the reasons? Yesterday, that was one. Have changed. Country up until the beginning of the century. Most of
It's not coming.
them were the so Africa is confronting rest everything. Yeah, guy. The best explain why to get the cost of that. This is why the one for the president on the camera. Yes. African countries are from 20 months forward to go.
The one from this one is not coming. It's not coming. This one is not coming.
Let's service. Conclusion. And and said, because of the virus, Western intelligences have had the more than don't want to say up to 70 years. Each,
Yeah, no, this don't happen.
reach after finish, after finish. So in terms of challenging, now in terms of alternative for allowed support.
Yeah, that's it. Project.
Global market or world from London from the world. I don't know but after for the reform of the international financial process, the reform of that, not only the working banking we have the few ways because as far as I know, the United States has little power for the form of values for world bank, for instance, policy, not only financial policy, but our policy, but reform, actually moved the power of the state, reforms, decisions or to reform why 85% more for the United States are that's why despite running what the world of South, like China and and the foreign is really this and also after countries are calling for the reform especially to then going to see each other I think that only 4.5% for the individual. It's important. So for 1.9 something new people that only 4.5% of the CPI allocation. So after them are calling for the involvement of this allocation. It's basically not on the political basis, but on the community basis. And of course, after you can see that according to our more cooperation with myself. So that they can be different in involving the global financial company. It's not also things the distribution is
The sound.
Good.
Just
in Africa.
True, yeah.
How do you recognize that as policy? You know, I have three of Arabic.
They went.
Only for this more, unfortunately, more. So, the proposal is great. Many people just rely on leadership without having leadership. These numbers just take them out and then. In the future. So that's complete and that. I think probably we have a few comments on whether we can comment that or we're good. Okay. All right. Before we go on, yeah. So before we go to now, about simulates so much. So we want to make it really big, but before I take the floor, let me ask you. Let me take advantage of my position right here and ask you the right about science and say, I'm happy to do development for many years and that we have connections that contact with the Thank you so much. But listen, I have the opportunity of sitting with the minister. Can you hear me? Oh, that's good. Okay. So I have the opportunity of sitting with a minister in Nigeria who runs the livestock and agriculture ministry. And he ordered about 2,000 tractors. And the 2,000 tractors, over the last 1 year, have been manufactured and taken delivery of about 1,000. And up until now, they've not been distributed to farmers, which means they got to be lost and some of them will become difficult to use. Where are those leaders? I have leaders like that in different parts of the continent that seem to not know what to do except to use the streets for season of the sunshine and find a way to get noticed. Does Africa have a chance of being able to say that there's going to be any improvement at any time soon in terms of agricultural development, not to mention the fact that we've been talking about not only